Project is titled Leveraging Technology to Improve Police-Community Relations. This team is focused on how AI and LLMs can transform the analysis of police body-worn camera footage. They are working to gain insights into police-public interactions, evaluate intervention tactics, and boost transparency. Let's give them a warm welcome.
I'm Jennifer Eberhardt, one of the PIs on this project, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning, and thank you all for coming. We are living in a time where trust is broken. Trust in our institutions, trust in AI, trust in democracy. We see it everywhere, in headlines and polling, in the gap between what's promised and what's delivered. In policing, the most well-known example of trust erosion is the case of George Floyd. In May of 2020, the world watched Floyd's final moments on camera footage that sparked protests across the globe. But there's something that, to this day, most people have not seen. Before Floyd was pulled from his car, before there was ever a knee on his neck, there was an interaction. Words were exchanged. Here are the first 27 seconds of that stop. Floyd offers a range of responses. But for Officer Lane, there is no range. He never gives the reason for the stop. Instead, every word he utters, every response to Floyd is an order. In our research, we've used large language models to analyze thousands of car stops, and we've discovered something critical. This type of exchange shows up again and again, even when it does not lead to tragedy. We call it the linguistic signature of escalation. And we can detect it in the very first moments of an interaction, well before an officer decides to handcuff, search, or arrest a driver. It's systemic, it's measurable, and that means it's preventable. What if departments could identify this signature across tens of thousands of interactions? What if officers had the feedback and the tools to change these patterns before the next stop? This is what our work makes possible, and the implications ripple far beyond policing. 5 years after George Floyd's death, policing remains at the center of our crisis of faith. It's where government power most directly touches the lives of people. If we can't trust the police, how can we trust any other democratic institution? But here's the other side of the equation. If we can build trust in this setting, healing is possible across American society, and that is what brings us here today. Today, law enforcement agencies across the country are turning to AI to fight crime. License plate readers, facial recognition, predictive policing. And this technology makes people nervous. Body-worn cameras are different. They enjoy overwhelming public support, over 90%. But here's what's interesting. Although people support the use of these cameras, they think of these cameras in the same way as they think of those other technologies, as tools for accountability after something goes wrong, as evidence for or against an officer in a specific incident. We take a completely different approach. The use of technology in policing doesn't have to be all about evidence or surveillance. Technology can be used for trust building. And over the past year, we've made incredible progress in this respect, progress that leaves us hopeful about the future of policing in this country. We've crossed many bridges in the Bay Area. We've engaged with police departments across the region, but in this last year, we've crossed a new one. We are building a data infrastructure that didn't exist before. We're asking questions that couldn't be answered before. Dan Jarafsky is here to explain how we built the foundation of this work and why the scale we have achieved changes everything. Thanks, Dan.
I want to start. I'm Dan Jarafsky. I'm a professor here in linguistics and computer science. And I want to start with a story. So in 2003, Oakland faced a scandal. So police officers had been planting evidence on innocent people. Many of whom went to prison for crimes they didn't commit. 119 plaintiffs filed claims. 118 of those were African American. The case led to federal oversight, a court-appointed monitor, attorneys and city leadership who knew something had to change. And those leaders reached out to Jennifer. And by then they had something that was at the time new and unprecedented, footage from body-worn cameras. Hours of footage documenting real interactions. And Jennifer saw this footage as data that could help us understand how a department interacts with its community. And that question aligns with HI's core mission. How do we build partnerships between academia and institutions? And how do we bring people together from different disciplines to tackle problems that matter? And this work required exactly that. So let me talk about our fabulous interdisciplinary team that's been working for this last year, funded by the Hoffman-E program. Jennifer is a social psychologist. She studies inequality in interactions and institutions, and she had reached out to me, a linguist and computer scientist, a decade ago. And we needed legal expertise and psychologists and engineers and linguists and people who understood the power of policy to promote change. And so we have you'll hear from postdocs Chen Shani and Michaela Spruill and Dan Sutton, who directs research on AI and public safety at Stanford Law School's Center for Racial Justice, and PhD students Julia Proshan and Marie Tano in the audience. And of course, our work this year draws on the foundations built by students who've gone on to become faculty themselves. And Rob Voigt, who you'll hear from next, did his dissertation on this work and is now a professor at UC Davis. Okay, how did all this start? We started small with traffic stops, 1,000 of them, 1 month of data. And over the next decade, we used AI and very early language models like BERT to study these interactions. And what we found, very briefly, are racial disparities in how respectfully officers speak. Black drivers across an interaction received measurably less respectful language than white drivers in similar encounters. So here's some wonderful things that we found officers saying, expressing concern for the driver, offering reassurance, but not so wonderfully, they say these things more to white drivers. We looked at tone of voice and found that officers used less respectful prosody to Black drivers, even before drivers speak. And we've replicated this effect with different groups, and all these variables are, of course, controlled for all, the results are controlled for all sorts of variables. And as Jennifer mentioned, we found that stops that escalate, that end in handcuffing, searches, arrest, have a linguistic signature from the very beginning. Officers are less likely to state the reason for the stop and very likely to start with an order. Even we were able, with early language models, to predict whether a stop will escalate from the officer's first words. But here's the limitation of all this work. This all required hand transcription, hand labeling. We had human experts, each one flown around the country to be fingerprinted and background checked, and then human experts transcribing and labeling every interaction. And that takes time, it takes money, and it meant we could only analyze hundreds of stops at a time, not thousands, not hundreds of thousands. So we were getting important insights, but we couldn't scale. And that's how this project is changing everything, and Rob's going to tell you about that change.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Voigt. I'm a professor of linguistics at UC Davis. And Dan just mentioned my dissertation analysis of 1,000 interactions, at the time an unprecedented scale. This was only possible because of years of relationship building that Jennifer and others did with police departments. And in the past year, we drew on that trust to dramatically increase our scale from what started as looking at 1,000 traffic stops times 1,000 to 1.3 million videos, including traffic stops, but also every kind of interaction that police have with the public. So how did we get access to this data, and how did we start to build this data infrastructure to ask larger questions? Well, the answer is difficult, sustained collaboration across public institutions, private companies, and the university. The approval process alone took 6 months, navigating police departments, mayor's offices, both Stanford and city legal departments, and sometimes even requiring votes from city councils. Then there were technical hurdles. Axon is the world's largest body-worn camera vendor, holding the data for most US police departments. But they had no process to export data at this scale because no researchers had ever attempted to analyze data at this scale before. So we met weekly with Axon engineers and police command staff to build out a process for this from scratch, creating infrastructure to store and use the data, including a secure server at the Stanford Research Computing Facility at the SLAC National Accelerator Lab, approved for the highest risk data with controlled physical access and multiple background checks for all team members. The result today is that we have 3 full years of virtually all body camera footage from 2 major police departments in the Bay Area, collected by 2,600 officers, totaling 1.3 million videos and 200,000 administrative records like stop forms and other things that officers fill out. This represents over 550 terabytes of data, capturing more than 300,000 hours of police community interactions. And this means that over the last year, we built what we believe is the largest research repository of policing data ever created by several orders of magnitude. This was the core goal of year 1 for this project, and we've achieved it at an incredible scale. Our next task was making this data usable for research, where our processing pipeline addresses 2 key challenges. First is metadata. Demographic information about each officer and the details from the forms that they fill out all has to be linked to the footage, and each agency represents that data differently. So coordinating with staff at both departments, we designed data linkage and harmonization algorithms to produce a set of canonical data that can be compared across agencies and over long periods of time. Second is transcription of the videos. Dan mentioned that this is a challenge in this area, and we've developed a pipeline for automatic speech recognition to transcribe words that are spoken, to diarize and say who's speaking, and to include officer speech detection to identify when officers are speaking versus other members of the public, using a modular architecture that can incorporate new models as technology improves. But we know that automatic transcription is absolutely unsolved for noisy multi-talker speech. So we also created the first public evaluation benchmarks of police speech to measure real-world performance from critical incidents that are released publicly on YouTube. In prior work, we developed ways to improve these models by fine-tuning on hand-transcribed examples. And in years 2 and 3, we can take advantage of the new scale of data we have access to adapt to particular officers, pre-train domain-specific models, and so on. This pipeline gives us the foundation for the research that we need to do. So now we're going to hear from 2 postdocs in the group about some early answers to some of the questions we've begun to ask. So I'll ask Hen to come up next.
Thank you, Rob. I'm a computer scientist who works at the intersection of human cognition, how you and I think, and natural language processing, which is how computers understand and generate human language. We apply AI tools to body-worn camera footage with the goal of improving human lives. Let's talk about two new tools we've developed. First, Dan shared our finding that encounters are significantly more likely to escalate when officer starts with asking for orders, giving orders, rather than stating the reason for the stop. While insightful, those findings came from a small sample that was hand-labeled. And now we actually have the tools to scale it up. So when an officer says something like, the reason I pulled you over is because you made an illegal U-turn, that's easy for AI tools, basic AI tools, to detect. But when officers are being more subtle, saying things like, there's no U-turn here, or running a light is dangerous, that gets more and more complicated and harder for AI tools to find. Using state-of-the-art LLMs with few-shot in-context learning and prompt engineering, we created a classifier that is highly accurate at detecting whether officers provided the reason for the stop. Our classifier is robust with high performance across multiple years and datasets. And this tool can detect reasons from good transcripts, but good transcripts are usually handmade. And we're in the process of extending these to AI-based models for automatic transcriptions. We're using them and extending and improving them. And Dan will present some preliminary results later. Our second new tool focuses on cooperation. In our earlier work, we used LLMs to analyze police stops, focusing mainly on officer speech. But now, we're aiming to capture the fuller dynamics between officers and drivers, asking questions such as who leads, and are drivers being actually cooperative, and which behaviors may drive escalation. We've developed a very comprehensive taxonomy of officer-driver behaviors, one that allows us to plot graphs that represent the dynamics of these interactions. For example, we can look at how cooperative drivers are and whether that affects officer behavior. And we can also test for differences that are based on race in cooperation and also in other behaviors. These are basically how these graphs look like, and these graphs help us discover that while both black and white drivers are equally cooperative, black drivers are more often issues direct orders without explanation. And white drivers are more likely to receive justification and information. Once again, these findings are based on manual annotations, and our plan for years 2 and 3 is to automate the detection process, allowing for large-scale analysis that could have critical implications for procedural justice and officer training. These tools illustrate the potential power of AI for improving police community interactions, tasks that once required painstaking frame-by-frame review will now deliver automatically insights that can be very crucial. We've developed and we continue to refine tools that open up entirely new ways to analyze police encounters at scale. This capability lets us evaluate interventions broadly, and Dan will explain why this is a true game changer. But first, Michaela will show you something that only this kind of analysis can reveal, how geography shapes these interactions. Michaela.
Thank you, Hen. My research as a postdoc here puts social psychology in conversation with the legal system. So I'm particularly interested in how systemic policies affect how individuals think about the world. And one of those meaningful policies is redlining. So back in the 1930s, facing a nationwide housing shortage, the US government created a program to increase available housing stock and prevent foreclosures. Maps were drawn up by the Federal Housing Administration, indicating to lenders which neighborhoods within cities were safe to insure and which were not. These color-coded maps marked the riskier areas in red, and those red areas also happened to contain the highest concentration of Black residents in those neighborhoods. So the discriminatory practice of denying mortgages based on redline maps was formally outlawed in 1968. But the effects of this policy have lingered over time. So redlining has indisputably been linked to modern racial disparities in everything from health outcomes to economic opportunities and to exposure to environmental toxins. So, you're probably wondering if redlining's legacy is also linked to current policing practices, and so were we. So we partnered with a police department in a redline California city, and using computational and experimental methods, we were able to analyze body-worn camera footage. So what you're looking at right now is a current city map overlaid with the 1930s redlined map. And today, the police department organizes the city into 5 distinct areas. 2 of those areas were historically redlined, and to this day, they're home to the city's largest percentage of Black residents. And so our body-worn camera analysis found that even after controlling for crime rate in these spaces, that people in the 2 historically redlined areas were more likely to be handcuffed, more likely to be searched, and more likely to be arrested. Further, when drivers in these areas are stopped, they are less likely to be spoken to with respect in comparison to folks that are stopped in the other areas. So to learn more about this, we actually went out into the community and conducted surveys. And what we learned from this community-engaged research is that Black residents across the city actually predict that they will receive significantly worse treatment from police in these areas. But this effect was not limited to just Black residents. Although white residents were generally more positive about police, they too were affected. And so this work shows us how the history of redlining has affected us all. Now, this work isn't finished. Redlining was a practice that was done all across the nation. And so we can see in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, there's still consequences of carrying this legacy of redlining in these different spaces. And we have the opportunity as a team to not only expand our data set, but to improve police-community relations around the country by affirming and grappling with the lasting connection between past injustices and present disparities. And so with this, I will hand it back to Dan to tell us how we're not only using these tools to identify and reveal problems, but also evaluate solutions.
Thanks, Michaela. Okay, so we've shown you problems, patterns that predict escalation, geographic disparities, and how people are treated. But here's what's critical about our approach. In addition to diagnosing problems, we can assess solutions. We could evaluate whether interventions actually work. So let me show you why this infrastructure matters for evaluation. We analyzed body-worn camera footage from officers in a Bay Area department who underwent procedural justice training. So that's a training that focuses on communicating with the public. And we looked at videos of the police, of their traffic stops, the few weeks before that officer had training and the few weeks after the officer had training. And we found measurable changes. Officers were more likely to state the reason for the stop. They were more likely to express concern for the driver's safety, and they were more likely to offer reassurance. The training worked, and we could see it in the language, in the interactions, and in real encounters. And this is a big deal because I don't know if you've taken bias training, but traditionally trainings like this are not rigorously evaluated. So officers are asked, did you like the training? And the approach we take of looking at the actual footage of people who've been trained is a huge leap forward. We're moving beyond survey evaluations to look at real interactions on the street. And that allows us to see what aspects of the training are being put to use, what aspects are most effective, for how long. And this kind of evaluation has the potential to save time and taxpayer dollars. Now, until now, this required manual analysis. But with all the automated tools that Hen talked about, we can now evaluate training effects across entire departments over years. And it's not just training. We can evaluate policy. So on January 1st of last year, a new California law took effect, you may know about this, which requires officers statewide to state the reason for the stop before questioning drivers. And this is exactly what our earlier training targeted, and it's exactly what Hen built a tool to detect automatically. So we can now measure compliance with the statewide law across tens of thousands of stops. And we did some preliminary analysis, and here's what we found in our preliminary work. Officers indicate on a form why they stopped the person, and they indicate that they've stated the reason for the stop 99% of the time. So on the form, officers say, I have given the reason for the stop. But when we ran Hen's preliminary classifier over the footage, what she found is over 20% of the car stops had no reason stated in the footage. And that's a very conservative estimate, so this gap is striking. Officers may be failing to state reasons far more often than their reports indicate. And the discrepancy could be due to many things, misunderstandings, the wording of the question on the form, some other cause, but this is a policy problem that we discovered. So not only can we rigorously examine whether trainings are working, we can examine whether policies are working, not through self-reports, but through systematic analysis of actual interactions. So when departments have a full picture of what's working, what's not working, they can refine approaches. And not just for individual officers, but department-wide, over time, systematically. That's the promise of this work. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Jennifer, who will conclude by giving our vision for where this could go.
Thanks, Dan. More than 20 years ago, not long after I started as an assistant professor here at Stanford, I read an article in the paper about a sheriff's office that was accused of racial profiling. And I decided to reach out to that sheriff, and that sheriff's name was Don Horsley. And I didn't expect him to respond, but to my surprise, he agreed to meet with me. So I went to his office, still not knowing how this conversation was going to go. And when I got there, I told him about my research, and I told him in this academic language that so many of us are fluent in, right? The studies and methods and graphs and, all that kind of stuff. But then I stopped myself. And I asked him, I looked up and I said, from my graphs, why did you agree to meet with me? And he said, because I really want to understand what's happening. If I have deputies who are profiling people, I want to understand why. And I want to know what I can do about it. And he explained that normally trying to understand a problem like this is a huge risk. It's one of those things that would open the office up to scrutiny and to lawsuits. But he felt I was offering a different way. It was an aha moment for him. And it was for me too. I realized that as academics, there's a place for us here. There's work we can do. And that launched a journey that has lasted more than 20 days. For most of those years, we couldn't answer his question, not at the scale that could lead to meaningful change. And we could identify problems, but we couldn't look at the entire department holistically across thousands of officers and tens of thousands of interactions. Now we can. Imagine a department where every training is evaluated in real time, where disparities can be addressed before they harden into permanent patterns, where officers get feedback that helps them to improve, not just scrutiny when things go wrong, and where the community sees evidence that they're being heard and that they have reason to trust. Now imagine not just one department. Imagine 10, imagine 50, imagine 100. Imagine researchers across the country testing different interventions, building different tools, creating an infrastructure commons that builds trust and accountability sector-wide, not just department by department. This isn't just about policing. It's about demonstrating a different approach, collaboration instead of antagonism. This is an approach that could transform how we tackle other challenges in life. This work started with the crisis of trust in one city and a call for help. But it could have just as well been anywhere. The crisis of trust in policing is a core challenge of our democracy. And that means rebuilding trust could spark healing in other realms of public life. Not long ago, one of the attorneys from that case Dan spoke about earlier got a visit to his office. It was one of the plaintiffs, this person who had been roughed up and had evidence planted on him and had no good reason to trust the police. But here he was now asking the attorney, "What did you do to the police?" And the attorney said, "Well, what do you mean?" And this guy says, "They're so nice now." He said, "I was stopped the other day and they talked to me like I was an upstanding member of the community." He said, "That's right, they treated me with respect." It was crazy. And he said, "What did you do?" Data can inform. Data can also heal. It can offer a way forward by understanding systems and by giving both the police and the community what they need to believe that change is possible. You know, although I never, or I guess I should say they never met these two men, I think about them all the time. This community member's experience and Sheriff Horsley's question, what could he do? Today, we finally have the tools to not only answer his question, we can use that answer to make change across this country. And with your continued support, we will. Thank you. Thank you. So should we invite the
Yes, please.
people?
Thanks so
Okay.
much, Jennifer and team. We'll invite the rest of the team members to the front for the Q&A portion. And we'll first open up questions to the selection committee.
Thank you all for this compelling pitch and the really compelling work. It's fantastic. I wondered if you could address the issue of perceived worker surveillance of the police. It's definitely an issue in work, and I wonder if you've thought about it and how.
Maybe I'll start and then we have thought about it. And I would say one high level thing that we think about a lot with this project is our work is studying the department in the aggregate. We're very careful not to write gotcha papers or this officer did this bad thing because we're trying to solve a systemic problem. And so I think it's really Jennifer and Dan who deal with negotiating with the departments, but I feel like their trust that we're not out to get an individual officer, but we're out to study in the aggregate, I think probably makes the department more comfortable and people more comfortable.
But for example, if a particular police officer wanted to see their data, how would that scenario progress? They would.
That doesn't really happen. Is this on? Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with the command staff and the police leadership, the chief, and so we're not actually in everyday interaction with the people who are on the ground. And we're trying to, as Dan said, to really understand not just, an individual person or even using the camera as it is typically used now for isolated cases. We think that's important, but our role there is to really understand patterns and to understand patterns in a way where we can offer the department as a whole a way forward. And so that they could really understand what's going on. Right now, they collect all this data, but they're not looking at the data in that kind of way. It's just one at a time, one piece of footage at a time. And so they're not really learning from it. And so that's what we offer.
Thank you. In your, I think the team's September 2024 PNAS Nexus article, you talk about the influence of a training regimen on behavior. I was curious if you ever introduce race specifically as a variable in that training and point that out to the officers of all races, and what kind of reaction. I didn't see that covered in the actual paper.
Yeah, I think, it was a part of the training. And I think one thing that was really unique about that training is because of the prior work we had done, we were able to say to the officers during the training, this is based on data from your department, and we have observed these racial disparities enacted by officers of your department in the real world. And so usually trainings are much more disconnected from actual people's experiences. But in this case, we could say, in fact, there is this quantifiable difference that's observed in your department. So it was discussed directly with the officers, and they were aware of it and responsive to it. There was interesting pushback from officers about particular features that we emphasized, like the use of informal titles, for example. But overall, I think that officers were responsive and said, yeah, we understand what you're talking about as far as respectfulness. But they were informed about it, absolutely.
And just a follow-up question. In the current climate that we're in, I could imagine all sorts of pushback on this kind of study, and the need to explain it with clarity and robustness to the scientific methods that you used. I first have to ask if you've gotten, besides the pushback that you just mentioned on titles, for example, informal titles, what kind of criticism have you received, and how have you been able to address and maybe mitigate the criticisms?
Yes, I mean, I think there's always, an issue of risk, I think, for the department, because, when we do our studies, it's independent of them. The findings obviously are independent. It's not something that they can control, and so that always makes police chiefs especially a little nervous. But again, as Dan mentioned, the papers we write are not intended to be gotcha questions. They're all papers that are really, even when we're outlining problems, it's outlining problems with this, this kind of position of, from a position of really trying to understand and find solutions. And it's not pointing out necessarily that it's this particular department with this particular problem, but this could be something, and oftentimes it is. It's the sort of common stuff that is across the departments that other chiefs could learn from. And so we're trying to push the industry to have more positive outcomes and better interactions with the public.
And I'll just add that the kind of criticisms we tend to get, like when we give talks, what people ask about always are confounds. Like, did you control for this? What about the officers who did this? What about, and so, luckily we controlled for mostly, we've controlled for things that people have asked for, but there's always going to be, something. Yeah. But I think we did pretty well.
And I think we also take this feedback and actually incorporate in future studies. So the cooperation tool was created because a lot of people ask whether we see these differences just because of how officers behave drivers, or whether we see these differences in how Black versus white drivers are being cooperative or not.
I have a question about change over time and longitudinal data sets as public perception awareness grows. You might see differences in these conversations, and new generations of police officers are educated based on some of your findings. are you looking at time trends, and how does that factor in your future work, not just to assess the effect of interventions, but to assess the changes of time and perception? And the second question I have is about international data sets. I'm curious, this isn't an area I know much about, but you have this incredibly interdisciplinary team of PIs, and I'm wondering what's happening in Europe, in Australia, in Africa, across the world, and if there are other data sets that you could learn from and inform your work.
You can look at that also with training, right? So right now, Dan was saying, they're just asked, did you like the training at the end? And that's the evaluation. So we can do more than that. But, we can also look at the shelf life of a training, because they're guessing about sort of how often the training is needed. And so they have no idea, and they wait for an incident to happen sometimes, and they're, okay, we need that procedural justice training again. But with the footage, you could see, right, how long-lasting the effects are when they start to fall off. You can also understand like what aspects of the training are doing the work. So there's a lot, and then you could feed that back to the trainer. So there's a lot of work that could happen in that way. Your question about looking at other countries, it's hard enough to look at this country. we're doing our best, but we'd love to do that one day.
And just add one last response, which is that Jennifer had been interested for a long time about what happens when you have exogenous shocks to the system. You have a police shooting, or the George Floyd incident. How does that affect how officers talk? How does that affect how people talk? And we don't have, we'll find out if there's events in the data we have, but those are just the kind of questions we're interested in.
So one last question before we have to move on. First, apologize, missed the first 15 minutes. I will watch that at lunch or tonight. So this has been really great work, and I've been watching it for several years. And maybe you got at this in the intro and I missed it, but is the key difference of what you've been doing in this new larger project a question of new research questions, or is it scale that now we could do this at a much more massive scale with the tools versus what you were doing, let's say 5 years ago? Can you touch on kind of what's new about it versus what you've done before? And this is probably true of all these projects. People have prior work that they're bringing into it.
I guess I could start and then you go. Yes, I think scale is a big part of it, but also doing with AI what we used to do with people. These are new research questions like, can we use AI to label these subtle social things like reasons or other kinds of things that people do in these conversations? Can we do speech recognition? Unsolved problems. Speech recognition on noisy, multi-parter speech is unsolved. So we have results that now with the new speech language models, you can prompt them just like you can with text language models. So we have results showing that if you prompt the language model and just tell it, the following sentence is spoken by a certain kind of speaker, we can improve speech recognition on that speaker. So there's all these questions about how do we deal with these technical problems, both of the text, like detecting reasons and cooperation, and of the speech that are now finally kind of at the place where we could solve them, where 3-5 years ago we didn't have the tools.
And I think just the very last thing, I think that crucially depends on this trust and relationships that we have with the departments to be able to access this scale of data. Because as you know, AI models of this type are data hungry. And in this particular domain, researchers have not ever had access to the scale that we now have been able to achieve. And all of the previous papers are on 1 month or a small setting. And now we have multiple years, enough data that we can potentially, even look to things like pre-training an ASR model from scratch for this domain, which we haven't been able to do before. So we rely on general purpose models, and now we have the scale.
All right, amazing. Let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.